Billionaire's missing child, found in a poor woman's home. DNA, result, shattered, you forgot me again. Dad, you always forget me. That was the last thing Ethan whispered before he stepped out of his father's car into the pouring Seattle rain. The city lights blurred behind the storm, and a billionaire's son disappeared into the streets. No limousine ever drove through. While his father kept talking about business, the boy was drowning in silence, proof that sometimes the richest homes hide the loneliest hearts. And that night, one mistake would tear two families apart forever. What would you have done in his place? Welcome to Emotional Echoes, a channel where emotions come alive and every story leaves a lasting echo in your heart. Please subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so more souls can feel these stories. Stay with my video till the very end and let me know where you're watching from, so I can see how far this story spreads. Now, let me tell you the story of the child who was never meant to be lost. It had been raining since noon, the kind of cold, endless Seattle storm that turned the city into glass. Ethan stood alone outside his school gate, shoes soaked, backpack heavy with water, watching the road where his father's car should have been 2 hours ago. Everyone else had gone home. The janitor had locked the doors. The lights were out, and he was the only one left waiting. His father had promised to be there by 3, but now it was almost 5. Ethan told himself that maybe there was traffic. Maybe the meeting had run late again. But deep down, he knew the truth. His father never forgot the things that made him money. He only forgot the things that made him human. When the black SUV finally appeared through the rain, Ethan felt a small surge of hope. He ran toward it, waving through the storm. The window rolled down halfway. Alexander Hale, still on his Bluetooth call, didn't look up. His voice was clipped, commanding, the same tone he used with his boardroom. Not his son. He gestured for Ethan to get in, then continued talking about deals and deadlines, as if the boy in the back seat didn't exist. Ethan slid into the seat quietly, his clothes dripping onto the leather. He waited for his father to ask how long he'd been standing there. But the question never came. He pressed his forehead against the window, watching the lights blur and smear across the wet glass. His fingers traced the fog on the glass, spelling the word home. But he wiped it away before his father could see. In his backpack, a crumpled drawing sat ruined by the rain, a picture of him and his dad at the park, holding hands, smiling under a sunny sky. He had drawn it for family day at school. He had wanted to show his father how it felt to have one. Now, looking at the reflection of a man too busy to turn around, he realized he didn't. The silence inside the car felt heavier than the storm outside. Alexander's voice filled the air again, talking about numbers and markets. Ethan closed his eyes. He imagined what it would be like to have a dad who showed up on time, who asked if he was cold, who remembered his favorite story before bed. But that kind of father only lived in books now. He had learned to stop asking for things that weren't on his father's schedule. When the car slowed near the bridge, Ethan looked out and saw the reflection of city lights on the dark water. It shimmered calm, endless, beautiful, a place where no one yelled, no one forgot, no one was too busy. He thought if he could just touch it, maybe the noise in his chest would stop. Before he could think twice, he reached for the door handle. The sound of the rain grew louder, as if the world was holding its breath. The door clicked open, and the wind rushed in like freedom. Alexander shouted his name, only when he saw the blur of movement. The headset fell. The phone call died, mid-sentence. He slammed the brakes and ran into the storm. The rain beating against his face. His shoes slipped on the slick pavement. But he didn't stop. He screamed Ethan's name, again and again, until his voice cracked. For the first time in years, the man who controlled everything realized there was something he couldn't buy back: time. Ethan ran until the sound of his father's voice faded. The road gave way to smaller streets, then to alleys he'd never seen before. His heart pounded as he turned corners, following nothing but the sound of rain and his own breath. He crossed under a bridge, the air colder, darker. The city here looked different, older, humbler, alive in a way his world never was. Houses leaned against each other, their windows glowing faintly, warm against the storm. He stopped near one with a crooked fence. The light from its window spilled onto the porch, soft and gold. Ethan hesitated, hugging his backpack close. He didn't know where he was, but for the first time, he didn't feel afraid, only tired. His knees gave out, and he sat on the wet ground, whispering that he just wanted to go home. Inside, Liam Parker sat by the window, watching the storm like he always did when he couldn't sleep. He was the same age as Ethan, but his eyes carried a quiet seriousness that didn't belong to children. When he saw a shadow outside the fence, he thought it was a stray dog. But then lightning flashed, and he saw the boy, same size, same face shape, but dressed like someone from another world. Liam's chest tightened. His mother's words echoed in his head. Kindness doesn't wait for permission. He opened the door, letting the cold rush in. The boy on the porch looked up, drenched, trembling. His lips blue, their eyes met, and for a moment, it was like looking into a mirror. The stranger's voice cracked as he said he just wanted to go home. Liam didn't hesitate. He reached out his hand and said, "No one should be left out in the rain." He led him inside, wrapping an old blanket around his shoulders. The room smelled faintly of soup and soap, small, cluttered, but warm. Grace Parker came out from the kitchen, ready to scold her son for opening the door again. But when she saw the boy sitting on her couch, her words vanished. Her hands froze midair. The boy's face, the same eyes, the same small scar under the chin. It was like looking at her son twice. For a long moment, she couldn't breathe. The two boys stared back at her, confused and silent. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside that tiny house, a different kind of storm began. Grace felt something deep in her chest shift, a truth she had buried years ago, suddenly waking. She whispered her son's name, and both boys looked up. And in that moment, Grace Parker felt her world split in two. By the next morning, the storm had passed. But Grace's heart hadn't stopped trembling. She stood in the kitchen, trying to make coffee with hands that wouldn't stay still. The boy from last night was still asleep on the couch, curled up beside her own son, as if the two had known each other forever. It should have been a comforting sight, but instead it filled her with a quiet dread she couldn't name. Something about it felt unnatural, like fate had folded in on itself. She turned on the old radio for noise, anything to drown the thoughts circling in her head. Then she heard it, the name Hale. The voice on the news was calm and clear, announcing the disappearance of Ethan Hale, son of billionaire Alexander Hale, missing since last night. Grace froze. The mug slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. She didn't hear the rest of the report. Her eyes went straight to the couch. The boy sleeping there wasn't just lost. He was that boy. Her knees felt weak. For a long moment, she couldn't move. She wanted to wake him, to shake him, to ask who his father was. But fear glued her to the spot. She whispered to herself that it couldn't be true. But when she looked closer, she couldn't deny what she saw. The same expensive sneakers, the faint logo on the jacket, and that face, too perfect, too familiar. Grace went to her bedroom, pulled open the drawer she rarely touched. Inside was an old envelope, yellowed and creased with time. It had been there for 8 years, buried under bills and letters she couldn't bring herself to throw away. She hadn't looked at it since the day everything went wrong. Her fingers hesitated before unfolding the paper inside. It was a torn hospital tag, the one she had hidden when no one would believe her. The faint ink still read, Baby B, Hale, Unit 302. Her chest tightened. She whispered that name again. Hale. It had haunted her once before. The memories came back, sharp and painful. 8 years ago, she had gone into labor alone during a storm almost as bad as last night's. The hospital was full, the lights flickering as the generators struggled to keep up. She remembered the nurse's voice shouting over the chaos, saying there were 2 babies born within minutes of each other. Both boys. The other mother's name had been Hale. Grace remembered because the nurse joked that both children would grow up rich and healthy. But Grace's laughter had stopped when the lights went out completely. When she woke after the surgery, she was told her son was healthy. But the bracelet on her wrist had the wrong initials. The nurse brushed it off as a clerical mistake. Days later, when she asked for the medical file, they told her it had been archived. She pressed harder, but the hospital's tone changed. One doctor warned her that accusations could ruin lives, hers included. She was a poor nurse from a small clinic. They said she must be confused, exhausted, emotional. She tried to fight, but no one listened. Eventually, she stopped asking because every time she did, another door closed. Now, 8 years later, the past stood in her living room wearing her son's face. She sank to the floor, clutching the paper in her hand. 1,000 questions flooded her mind. If the boy was really the missing child, then who was Liam? What had they done to her baby that night? And what would happen if the truth came out? Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She looked toward the couch, where both boys were still asleep, their heads resting close together. The resemblance was undeniable. The longer she looked, the harder it became to breathe. She wanted to believe it was a coincidence, that fate wasn't cruel enough to play this trick on her. But deep down, something told her it wasn't a mistake. It was a buried truth finally clawing its way back. When Ethan stirred, his voice was soft and lost. He asked where he was, if his dad was looking for him. Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. She wanted to tell him yes, that his father was searching, that everything would be fine. But she couldn't lie. Not when her hands still shook from the truth sitting in her drawer. She told him he was safe, that he could rest, even though she didn't believe it herself. As the morning light crept through the window, Liam came over, rubbing his eyes. He saw Ethan sitting up, confused and scared, and did what he always did. When someone cried, he tried to make it better. He grabbed an old toy car and placed it in Ethan's hand, saying it always helped him when he was sad. Ethan didn't smile, but he held it tight. Then Lily, still pale from the night before, shuffled in with her small blanket. She looked at the stranger on their couch. her brother's mirror, and tilted her head. Her voice was small but certain when she said that he didn't need to cry because her brother could fix anything. Grace pressed a hand to her mouth as the words hit her. Her daughter didn't know she had just spoken the truth. Neither of them could face that the boy who would fix everything might not be the one she had raised. By the time the police found the signal from Ethan's smartwatch, the storm had returned. Alexander Hale drove faster than the flashing lights behind him. His chest burned with fear he couldn't control. He had spent all night calling, shouting, begging strangers to help him find his son. But now that the location was on his screen, all he could feel was dread. The coordinates pointed to Rainier Avenue, a place he had never been. A place that didn't belong in his world. The car skidded to a stop in front of a narrow street, lined with dim lights and broken fences. The rain fell harder, slapping against the windshield. Through the haze of headlights, Alexander saw a small house with its porch light flickering. A figure was standing in the doorway, a woman holding a little girl in her arms. Her hair plastered to her face, and beside her, under the yellow porch light, stood two boys. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Ethan was there, alive, wet, shivering, small. But next to him was another boy, same height, same face, same eyes. His mind refused to make sense of what he was seeing. He stepped out of the car without realizing, the rain soaking through his coat instantly. He took a step closer, voice trembling. He called Ethan's name, and the boy turned toward him, his face lighting up with both relief and confusion. Then the other boy moved too. His reflection, his double. Alexander stopped in his tracks. His heartbeat roared in his ears. Grace felt her arms go weak. She could barely hold Lily anymore. The sight of the man from the news, the father she had seen on TV begging for his son's return, made her stomach twist. He was taller than she expected, but his face carried the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept in days. His eyes darted between Ethan and Liam, unable to tell them apart. He whispered that he didn't understand. Who was the other boy? What was happening? Grace wanted to speak, but her mouth felt dry. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind all morning, and yet now that it was here, she wanted nothing more than to hide. She looked at Liam, her son, and then back at Alexander, the man who might take him away. The headlights cut through the rain, casting long shadows across their faces. The two boys stood side by side, blinking under the harsh light, both confused, both afraid. For a second, Alexander thought he was looking at a trick of the storm, some cruel illusion brought on by exhaustion. But the longer he stared, the more real it became. He asked again who the other boy was. His voice cracked. He took another step forward, and the rain dripped from his hair, tracing down his jaw. Grace finally found her voice. It came out barely above a whisper. Trembling, but certain, she said the boy's name, Liam Parker. Alexander repeated it, as if trying to remember. Then he shook his head. He said the boy looked just like his son. His voice grew sharper, almost demanding an explanation. Grace's heart pounded so hard, she thought it might stop. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. She took a deep breath and said something she had never imagined saying aloud. She told him there had been a mistake long ago. One she tried to forget. She told him she wasn't sure how or why. But the boy standing next to Ethan might not have been hers to begin with. The words fell heavy between them. The rain seemed to pause. Alexander stared at her, unblinking, his face pale. He said it was impossible, that no mother could confuse her own child. Grace's voice broke as she answered that she never confused him, that the world had done it for her. He took another step forward, his shoes splashing in the puddles. His voice was low now, almost pleading. He asked why she was saying this, what she wanted. Grace shook her head. She said she wanted nothing. Then her eyes filled with tears. She said she had spent 8 years loving that boy, watching him grow, caring for him as her own. But when she saw his face next to Ethan's, something inside her broke. Her voice faltered as she looked at both boys. Then back at the man in front of her, she said maybe it was crazy, maybe it was wrong. But she couldn't ignore what her heart told her. The two boys were never meant to be strangers. She stepped closer, her voice soft and trembling. Maybe because he was supposed to be yours. The next few days blurred together. Reporters crowded the street, their cameras flashing through Grace's curtains. Headlines screamed her name in every tone possible. The woman who stole a billionaire's son. The mother who lied. No one cared about the torn hospital tag or the 8 years she had spent raising a child alone. The truth didn't matter. The noise did. Grace stayed inside, blinds drawn, holding Lily close as the world tore her life apart, one headline at a time. When she finally stepped outside to get groceries, the reporters swarmed her. They shouted questions, their microphones like weapons. Was it true she switched the babies? Did she plan to sue? Did she regret it? She didn't answer. She just kept walking, her eyes fixed on the ground, her daughter's small hand gripping hers. But in the crowd, she saw Liam's face pressed to the window. He was watching his mother being swallowed by voices and flashlights. His expression a mix of confusion and fear. That image would stay with him long after the cameras were gone. Alexander watched the same chaos unfold from behind the tinted windows of his car. His world, once neat, measured, predictable, now looked like a battlefield of headlines and lawyers. His phone never stopped ringing, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. His reflection in the glass looked older, colder, hollow. Every word he had thrown at Grace in anger echoed back at him now, louder in the silence. He had called her a liar, a manipulator. But when he saw the photo of her outside her small apartment, shielding her daughter from the cameras, something inside him cracked. The next morning, his lawyer brought him the DNA results. 2 envelopes, marked with the names Ethan Hale and Liam Parker. Alexander didn't open them right away. His hands shook as he reached for the paper on his desk, the one Grace had given him that night in the rain. The faint writing had almost faded, but the words were still there. Baby B. Hale, Unit 302. For a long time, he just stared at it. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock. He ran his thumb over the ink, imagining Grace's trembling hands holding it all those years ago. Every instinct in him, the businessman, the man who won every fight, wanted to prove her wrong. But something deeper, quieter, whispered that maybe she never had to be wrong for him to have been cruel. He remembered her face that night, pale under the porch light, rain streaking down her hair as she said, "Maybe because he was supposed to be yours." At the time, he thought she was insane. Now, the words wouldn't leave him. They clung to the walls of his mind, gentle but relentless. He finally opened the envelopes. The first line of the report hit harder than any lawsuit could. Ethan Hale, biological son of Alexander and Vanessa Hale. Liam Parker, biological son of Alexander Hale. The room tilted. He read it again, slower this time, hoping the words would change. They didn't. The air felt heavy, too thick to breathe. He leaned back in his chair, pressing the paper to his forehead. For years, he had believed he was a victim of bad luck, a man who lost his wife, who raised a son alone, who had to build walls to survive. But now he saw the truth. He hadn't lost his family by fate. He had lost it by neglect. Later that evening, when he finally went to see Liam at the mansion, he couldn't find the right words. The boy looked up at him, quiet and careful, as if afraid to move wrong. Alexander wanted to say something, anything, but his throat refused to open. All he managed was a hand on the boy's shoulder. Gentle, uncertain. For a second, Liam leaned in, like a child who didn't know whether to trust the touch. Alexander's eyes burned, and he turned away before the tears could fall. Meanwhile, Grace sat in the small kitchen of her apartment, her world shrinking with every headline. The phone rang again and again until she unplugged it. Lily drew at the table beside her, humming softly, pretending not to notice the way her mother's hands shook. Outside, the reporters finally left, but the silence they left behind was worse. Grace pressed the old hospital tag to her chest and whispered that she hadn't lied. Not then. Not now. When the official custody papers arrived, she didn't cry. She had no tears left. The court declared temporary guardianship of Liam Hale to the Hale family. The words didn't feel real. She signed them anyway, her hand trembling as she wrote her name. The pen left a small ink stain on the paper, one imperfect mark that said she was still there. The day they came to take Liam, the cameras returned. He tried to smile for her, brave and quiet, but his lip trembled when he hugged her. He asked if he'd still see her, if he'd still be her son. Grace knelt down and kissed his forehead. She said no one could ever change what they were, no matter what the papers said. Then she stood back and watched as he was led to the car. Outside, Alexander waited, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. When Grace walked up to him, the air between them felt heavier than the clouds above. She looked him straight in the eyes and said softly, "You can take him home, Alexander, but don't think that blood makes you his father." Her voice didn't shake. His did. For the first time, Alexander Hale had nothing to say. He turned away, clutching the papers in his hand like they weighed 1,000 pounds. As Grace's figure grew smaller in the rearview mirror, a woman the world had broken, but not destroyed. The Hale mansion had never felt so large and so silent. After the court ruling, after the headlines and the cameras, the house returned to its old rhythm, polished, perfect, and hollow. Two boys now sat at the same breakfast table, identical faces separated by invisible walls. The staff spoke in whispers, unsure which name to use when one of them called. Ethan pushed his cereal around the bowl, while Liam quietly stirred his milk, too afraid to make a sound that might feel wrong. Alexander sat at the end of the table, staring at his untouched coffee. He had imagined this moment as a reunion, some kind of redemption. But now that it was real, it only felt heavy. The house that once echoed with confidence now seemed built on guilt. Ethan looked at his father, waiting for something, a glance, a word, anything. But Alexander's eyes were on Liam, checking if he had eaten, if he needed anything. For Ethan, that small gesture felt like a wound reopening. Vanessa Hale returned 3 days later. The press had begun asking questions about her absence, and her publicist insisted she come home to restore the family image. She arrived with suitcases and silence, her heels clicking through the marble hallway like a reminder of the past Alexander had tried to leave behind. When she walked into the dining room and saw Liam sitting at the table, her expression froze for just a second. Then came the faintest smile, polite, sharp, and cold. She greeted Ethan with a quick hug and turned to Alexander. Her voice was calm, but carried an edge. "So this is the child everyone's talking about." The way she said child made it sound like something contagious. Liam lowered his eyes, murmuring a small, "Hello." Vanessa's gaze traveled over him, taking in the resemblance. The same eyes, the same hair. It unsettled her. "You're keeping him here?" she asked. Half disbelief, half disgust. Alexander's reply was quiet but firm. "He's my son." Vanessa laughed under her breath, the sound brittle. "Blood doesn't make someone a Hale. Alexander, you of all people should know that." She looked around the table, at the two boys, then back at him. "Do you really think this helps anyone? The press is already circling. You're turning our family into a charity case." Ethan watched his father carefully. He expected him to argue, to defend their name, the way he always did. But instead, Alexander stood up slowly, walked to Liam, and placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "He stays," he said simply. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to end the conversation. Vanessa's narovet. She looked at the boy, then back at her husband, as if seeing the crack in her world widen. "You'll regret this," she said, voice low. "Alexander Meterhaze." "I already do," he answered. She left the room without another word, her perfume lingering like a ghost of who she used to be. Ethan sat frozen. The scene replayed in his head, his father defending Liam, standing between him and Vanessa like a shield. He'd never seen his father protect anyone like that. Not even him. The jealousy was sharp, unfamiliar. He hated that it made him want to cry. He pushed his chair back suddenly, the legs scraping the floor, and left the table. Liam turned to look, confusion in his eyes. But Ethan didn't stop. He just needed to breathe somewhere else. Alexander watched his son walk away but didn't follow. He knew that silence between fathers and sons could be more dangerous than shouting, but he didn't yet know how to break it. The mansion, with all its chandeliers and marble, suddenly felt too big for three people who didn't know how to talk. That night, the rain returned soft, steady, like memory. Ethan lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the look in his father's eyes when he spoke to Liam. He didn't understand how one house could hold so much love and loneliness at once. Across the room, Liam was still awake too, tracing patterns on the blanket with his finger. Both boys stared into the dark, each wishing they could trade places, each not realizing how similar they were in their hurt. Down the hall, Alexander stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. For years, he had believed silence meant strength, but now it only sounded like regret. Somewhere, upstairs, two boys who shared his face were learning what it meant to live in the same home, yet feel worlds apart. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer he had never said before, not for success, not for forgiveness, but for a way to make his children whole again. The tension in the Hale mansion grew heavier with each passing week. What had once been whispers of confusion had turned into silence so thick it hurt to breathe. Grace's name was everywhere in newspapers, on talk shows, in gossip threads that chewed her life apart. They called her the woman who claimed a billionaire's son. They called her delusional. No one mentioned the torn hospital tag or the 8 years of quiet motherhood she had given. The truth had a price, and she was the one paying it. She filed a lawsuit against the hospital. She thought if she just told her story, someone would listen. But when she walked into court, she realized what power looked like. The lawyers representing the Hale Corporation smiled like they had already won. They didn't attack her facts, they attacked her life. They painted her as unstable, emotional, a woman desperate for attention. One of them even said she should be grateful her child was now in better hands. That line broke something inside her. Her co-workers stopped calling. Her supervisor at the clinic told her she needed to take a leave until the situation settled. It never did. Her landlord raised the rent after reporters camped outside. Lily's school whispered everywhere she went. People looked at her like she was poison. She spent her nights writing letters to lawyers who never replied, and her mornings pretending to smile for her daughter. The only thing that kept her from breaking completely was the hope that Liam might still remember her voice. Meanwhile, the Hale mansion was cracking from the inside. Liam tried to stay invisible. He woke early, helped the maids, sat quietly through breakfast, and counted the hours until bedtime. He missed the sound of Grace humming in the kitchen, the warmth of their tiny apartment, the way Lily's small hand used to slip into his. Here, everything was perfect and cold. The servants whispered about him. Vanessa's glares said what no one else dared to. He didn't belong. Ethan noticed it too. He saw how everyone looked at Liam, how his father softened around him, how guilt seemed to follow Alexander everywhere. At first, Ethan pitied the boy. Then pity turned into anger. His father had once been his whole world. But now that world had split in two. One night, when he found Liam sitting alone in the dark living room, Ethan couldn't hold it in anymore. He asked why Liam had to come here, why he couldn't just go back to where he came from. Liam didn't answer. He just kept staring at the floor. Ethan's voice grew louder, full of a hurt he didn't know how to name. He said Liam had taken his father, his place, his home. He said he wished the truth had stayed buried. Liam looked up, eyes shining with tears he refused to let fall. He said softly that Ethan was lucky to have a father to lose. Ethan blinked, confused. Liam's voice broke as he whispered the words that hung in the air like glass. I never even had one. Alexander stood in the hallway, frozen. He had come down to tell the boys it was time for bed. But the words never left his mouth. The sentence hit him harder than anything in his life. He leaned against the wall, trying to steady himself. For the first time, he understood what his guilt had created. 2 broken children and a home full of ghosts. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his office, staring at the framed photo of his family before everything fell apart. He realized that money had bought silence, not peace. So the next evening, when the world had quieted down, he did something no one expected. He drove alone to the south side of the city, to a shelter where Grace had been staying after losing her home. The place was dim and crowded, but she looked the same, tired, proud, unbroken. She didn't seem surprised to see him. They sat across from each other at a metal table while the rain tapped softly on the window. For a long time, neither spoke. He finally said he was sorry. He told her he had tried to fix things, but every move he made seemed to make it worse. He said he didn't know how to make it right anymore. Grace looked at him with eyes that had already cried everything they could. She said she didn't hate him. Hate was easy. What she felt was heavier disappointment. He told her he would make sure she was treated fairly, that the lawyers would stop attacking her. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. She said fairness was a word rich men liked to use when they already had everything. She thanked him for caring, but said some things couldn't be fixed with money. When he stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. He turned back and asked how she could still be so calm after everything. Her answer came quietly, without anger, just truth. She said he was a good man, trapped in the wrong world. Then she looked at him and said the words that stayed with him long after he drove away. You love your world too much to lose it. The night after Alexander's visit to the shelter, the world seemed too quiet. Grace sat on the edge of her cot, watching Lily sleep under a thin blanket, her small chest rising and falling in rhythm with the wind outside. It had been weeks since the custody ruling, and though the pain hadn't faded, she was learning to live around it. But peace has a cruel way of breaking when you start to believe it might last. The fire started just after midnight. A spark from the faulty heater, a soft crackle that turned into a roar. Grace woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of breaking glass. She ran toward the sound, coughing, shouting for Lily. The air burned her lungs, the heat pressing against her face like punishment. She saw the flames crawling up the walls of their small apartment, devouring everything they had left. Lily's voice came faintly from the back room, calling for her. At the same moment, miles away in the Hale mansion, Liam woke with a start. He had dreamed of his old home, of the rain dripping through the roof, of Lily's laughter. But this time, the dream smelled like smoke. He sat up, heart pounding, a fear he couldn't explain, tightening in his chest. Something was wrong. He threw off the blanket, ran down the hall, and slipped out the door before anyone noticed. Ethan heard the noise. When he saw Liam running through the gate barefoot, he followed, calling after him. Liam didn't stop. He ran through the night streets, his lungs burning in the cold air, his feet slapping against the wet pavement. Ethan caught up halfway down the road, breathless and angry, asking where he was going. Liam just said one word, Lily. By the time they reached the old neighborhood, the street was glowing orange. Sirens wailed in the distance. Neighbors shouted, and the smell of smoke was everywhere. The small house where Grace had lived was a wall of fire. Grace was outside, screaming her daughter's name, clawing at the firefighters, holding her back. The boys didn't think. They ran straight past the crowd and into the house. Inside, the air was thick and black. Ethan couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The heat wrapped around him like a living thing. He could hear Liam shouting Lily's name, his voice hoarse. A small cough answered from behind a fallen beam. Lily was trapped near the corner, clutching her stuffed bear, eyes wide with terror. Liam crawled toward her, his arms scraping against the floorboards, and pulled her close. Ethan helped lift the beam, his hands burning from the heat. Together, they carried her toward the faint light of the doorway. Outside, Grace screamed as the flames burst from the window. Then a shadow appeared through the smoke. Alexander, his coat still on, his face pale as he ran from his car. He didn't stop to think. He pushed through the chaos, shouting for the boys. When he saw them stumbling through the doorway, Lily limp in Liam's arms, he rushed forward. He grabbed the girl, wrapping her in his coat, coughing violently as he carried her out. The fire hissed behind him, furious that it had failed to keep what it had taken. Grace fell to her knees the moment she saw her daughter in his arms. She pulled Lily close, checking her pulse, her face, every breath. The girl was alive. The sound that came from Grace's chest was half sob, half prayer. She looked up at the two boys, both coughing, faces smeared with soot, trembling from the cold and the terror. Ethan leaned against Liam, both too tired to stand. Alexander knelt beside them, tears cutting through the ash on his face. For a long moment, no one spoke. The night was filled only with the sound of sirens and wind. Grace finally looked at him, voice shaking with exhaustion and rage and love, all tangled together. She said they both could have died for a world that broke them. Then she buried her face in her daughter's hair, crying until there was nothing left to cry. The fire changed everything. It burned more than walls and memories. It burned through pride, anger, and fear until only the truth was left behind. In the weeks that followed, the world that had been split in two began to quietly mend itself. Alexander Hale stopped showing up at board meetings. The empire he once protected like a crown no longer seemed worth the cost. One morning, he announced he was selling part of his company. The money went into a new foundation, the Parker Hale Foundation, created to help families torn apart by hospital mistakes and to rebuild lives lost in silence. It was his way of saying sorry to a world he had ignored too long. Grace returned to work at the clinic. The same patients who once looked at her with doubt now greeted her with respect. The hospital issued a formal apology. The news cycle moved on, and for the first time in years, she could breathe without waiting for something else to be taken from her. She and Lily moved into a small house near the lake, quiet and warm, with a little garden out front. When she looked at the water each morning, she thought of both her boys and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude that life had spared them. Vanessa left the mansion soon after. Her departure was quiet, almost invisible. She packed her things without goodbye. For her, the house had turned into a museum of shame. Alexander didn't stop her. He had already learned that some things were not meant to be saved. What remained in that house wasn't wealth or perfection, but the fragile beginning of something real. Ethan and Liam now lived between two homes, 2 weekends with Grace and Lily, 2 weeks at the Hale estate. The arrangement was strange at first, but slowly it became normal. The boys grew close again, in their quiet way. They shared glances more than words, and when they argued, it no longer hurt like before. Each night before bed, they wrote letters they never sent. Liam's handwriting was crooked, Ethan's sharp, but both said the same things in different ways. One letter from Ethan read, "You're my brother, not my mistake." Another from Liam said, "You're my home, not my rival." They kept the letters in an old wooden box under Liam's bed, locked but never forgotten. Sometimes, when Grace visited the foundation or when Alexander stopped by the clinic, their eyes met with a kind of peace that words could not hold. The world had broken them in ways they would never fully recover from. But in the quiet afterward, love had found a way to grow again. The nights were still cold in Seattle, but when the boys laughed together, the world seemed just a little bit warmer. A year passed quietly after the fire, but its lessons lingered in every heart it touched. The world around them had softened. The foundation that once began as an apology had turned into something alive. On a gentle spring afternoon, sunlight poured across the Parker Hale Foundation's garden, where fresh soil carried the scent of renewal. Grace knelt beside a row of saplings, her hands steady, her eyes calm. Alexander stood nearby, watching her with a quiet respect he no longer tried to hide. The boys were laughing somewhere behind them, chasing Lily across the grass. Their voices were full of life, echoing through the open field like the sound of forgiveness itself. It was the first time in years that laughter didn't hurt. It didn't remind anyone of what was lost. It simply existed, free and whole. Alexander bent down, helping Grace press the roots of a young oak into the earth. The motion was simple, but it felt sacred. He had spent most of his life digging into the ground of ambition, planting only things that would grow his empire. But none of it had ever felt like this. He looked at his hands, covered in soil, and realized they were finally doing something clean. He said softly that he had spent years building an empire, but somehow lost his heart along the way. His voice cracked as he admitted that he had measured his worth by the buildings he owned, not by the love he gave. Grace looked at him with the same calm strength that had carried her through every storm. She told him that sometimes God breaks us just enough to remind us where love lives. The words settled in the air like sunlight through leaves, and Alexander nodded. Unable to speak, Lily skipped over to them, her cheeks pink, her little hands full of daisies she had picked. She asked where to plant them. Grace smiled, pointing to the corner near the bench where the light was softest. Lily dug her small hands into the dirt, and her brothers joined her. Ethan and Liam knelt side by side, their identical faces glowing in the light. They didn't look like two halves of a mistake anymore. They looked like one story finally whole. Alexander watched them, his chest heavy but warm. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could choose what kind of father he would be from this moment forward. Grace placed a hand on his arm, and for a second, it felt like the noise of the world had finally gone quiet. As the last tree was planted, the sun dipped low, painting the garden in gold. Lily looked up at her brothers, brushing dirt off her dress. She said proudly that now both her brothers could walk her to school. The simplicity of it made everyone smile. Grace reached for Alexander's hand, and he didn't pull away. In that golden silence, surrounded by the garden they had built together, Alexander felt something he hadn't in years. Peace, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't leave. From a storm that began with a forgotten child came a family rebuilt by love. Ethan, Liam, Grace, and Alexander all learned that blood may connect us by chance, but compassion is what truly makes us belong. Sometimes life breaks us only to show us where love lives, in forgiveness, in sacrifice, in the courage to start again. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments and let me know what moment stayed in your heart. Please subscribe, like, and share this video so more people can feel its echo. Thanks for listening.